Welcome to Golf Training Hacks. In 2023, we'll be launching golftraininghacks.com. We're really excited about this website. It will give us the opportunity to provide you with more comprehensive approaches to improving your movement quality, to reducing injury risk, and to helping you create that fluid, effortless swing that creates the easy power that we all want. And that's the swing that reduces injury risk. So I want to share with you a webinar, at least one of the webinars in a series that's on the site called Start Reducing Injury Risk. So check this out, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the second webinar in our series on starting to reduce the injuries from golf. In this webinar, we're going to go into a little more detail about the fluid, effortless swing that we all want. It's a swing that creates the easy power, and it's a swing that reduces injury risk because it's a nice fluid motion. It puts your joints into the best position to swing a golf club without getting hurt. In the first webinar, we talked in general terms about why the golf swing is so difficult, why it's so hard on the body, because it's a high velocity asymmetric rotation with side bending that puts a lot of shearing and compressive forces in your spine of the joints, right? And we keep accumulating those repetitions with pre-existing conditions, and we raise our injury risk. Sometimes the golf swing actually creates the preconditions that then raise the injury risk. So it's a tough movement. We also talked about, in general, ways that we can begin to reduce that risk, improving our movement quality, but not through exercise, through non-exercise activity, like things you can do around the house, everyday activities like washing the car or cutting the grass, sitting on the floor when you're watching TV a little bit more, walking, stand-up desks. There's a variety of things you can do every day that will improve your movement quality. But we also talked about something that's very important. Staying healthy, maintaining your health as you age. Good health is the substrate and precursor upon which everything I'm going to talk about is built, right? If you're fighting a chronic illness or disease, it's really tough to improve your golf swing. In fact, that's not what you're worried about. You're just worried about getting your health back. And we talked about general ways that you can start working on improving your health, things like reducing inflammation through nutrition, reducing or eliminating sugar and grain, improving your breathing patterns, breathing through your nose, slowing down your breathing cadence, avoiding Lyme disease, things like that. So obviously that's a very short list. There's a lot more you can do for your health, but those are a few things. But good health is the precursor. It's the substrate upon which everything is built. In this video, we're going to talk in a little more detail, as I said, about that fluid, effortless swing. And the first thing is we have to prioritize our spine. We want to rotate around a neutral, stable spine. That's so important, right? Rotating around a neutral, stable spine is the priority. So what's a neutral spine? Well, first off, a neutral spine is this spine position that best buffers force. And it's not a flat back. That's not a good spine. That's not healthy. Your spine has a gentle S-curve in it. Your spine should not be straight. Now, I'm not a great artist, but I'm going to try to put a little S-curve here, okay? In your neck, in your cervical spine, you should have some extension. In your T-spine, your upper back, you should have some flexion. And then in your lumbar spine, you should also have some extension. Not too much and not too little. And you certainly shouldn't be stuck in flexion or extension, and particularly not stuck in too much flexion or too much extension. That's not good. And you want your spine to rotate. You want those vertebral joints to move. What could stop it? Well, muscular imbalances that hold things, lock things down, herniations that cause a lot of pain that you just don't want to rotate, chronic situations, bony blocks, whatever. The few things that can stop your spine from rotating. So we want to be able to have a healthy spine so it can rotate. So a healthy spine rotates, it can extend and flex out of these positions within the framework of a healthy spine, but it's certainly not flat. Now, in terms of rotating around a neutral spine, you have to hit certain spine angles, okay? So we not only want to rotate around the neutral stable spine, we want to hit certain spine angles in the golf swing. And I'm going to go over them quickly. So at address, you're going to set your neutral spine. You want to hip hinge back. That means your belt buckle is pointed to the ground. So from the front, I'm going to hip hinge back. Now, when I hip hinge back, I didn't roll my shoulders to get there. My spine angle is dropping, right? So I've hip hinged back, and now my spine tilts a little bit away from the target. I'm putting pressure on the inside of the rear foot, and now I begin to rotate. But my hip hinge, my pelvic angle stays pointed to the ground. So as I go into my backswing, my belt buckle is still pointed to the ground. And as I come through impact, my belt buckle is still pointed to the ground. What changes is that as you get closer to impact, your spine angle drops a little bit further away from the target, and that's how you have that side bending. So you certainly don't want to stand up, right? If you're standing up, you're losing your spine angle, you're creating movement variability in your swing, and you're never going to get back to your swing with consistency. So as you come through impact and you release leg out in front of the ball, you're not releasing leg at the ball, you're releasing leg out in front of the ball, and then your hip position changes, and as you come into your follow through, your belt buckle is pointed down the fairway and you've turned into your follow through. So that's a quickly what I'm talking about in terms of spine angles. So you want to hit certain spine angles while you're keeping that neutral, stable spine. Now the next thing we want to talk about, and in one sense this should be the first thing, is your hips. We want to get rotation out of the hips, right? Your hips need to rotate in the golf swing. That's really important. Your hips need to be aligned, they need to be strong, and they need to be mobile to get that rotation. Your hips need to lead the way. And as I said, your pelvis also has to maintain a certain angle so that your belt buckle is kept pointed to the ground through a lot of the shot. So that's so important. What can disrupt all of this? Postural issues. You need to be able to keep good posture, is really what we're talking about here, in your golf swing. Now, if you can't keep good posture every day, if you have muscle imbalances and misalignments that cause you to be in postural dysfunctions just every day, then that's going to leak into your golf swing. It's going to be really hard to have a fluid swing if your posture is off, if you can't get into these positions. And it's going to be an injury risk. So let's talk about a couple of very common postural issues. One is called lower cross syndrome. And it really is a postural issue that's involved with your hips. But this is all interrelated. Nothing in your body works in isolation. So if you have a problem in your ankles, that could be affecting your hips. If you have a problem in your hips, that could be affecting your shoulders. You're connected from the top of your head to your toes. So nothing is in isolation, but this happens to be a muscular imbalance in your hips. And one way you can get this muscular imbalance is something that we do too much in this modern world, is sit. This position. Now what's a muscular imbalance? Well, a muscular imbalance is your body's adaptation to chronic positions, movement, or lack of movement. So you're in one position all the time, your body adapts to it. Just like lifting weights, right? Your body adapts. You lift weights, your muscles get bigger and stronger. If you stop putting force into your muscles, it'll adapt, the muscles will adapt, and then they get weaker and smaller. Well, muscles can also get stiffer and tighter and chronically shortened or chronically lengthened and stretched based on what you do all the time, what your habits are, and what position you put your body in all the time. So in this case, we're in this flex position of our hip. So our hip flexors are in a 90-degree position. They get short and tight. So let's talk about how this X works. So it's a cross, right? So your hip flexors are attached here. They go over your pelvis, and they attach into your lumbar spine. So they get short and tight because they're in this position. So your hip flexors get short and tight, and because your hip flexors are attached to your lumbar spine, they pull your spine into too much extension, and the muscles in your lower back short and tight. So lower back muscles get short and tight. So that's one leg of the X. Now we're not going to talk about, this is an anatomy class. We don't have to talk about exactly what muscles they are. Lower back muscles, hip flexors, right, they get short and tight. Now, since you're sitting, the chair takes the place of your postural muscles. And in this case, your abdominals and your glute max. They get weak. So that's the other leg of the X. So you have your glute max and your abs. Of course, your hip muscles, there's a few gluteus muscles and there's a bunch of abdominal muscles, but we just call them glutes and abs, glute max and abs, right? That's the big one back here. They get weak. That's the other leg of the X. So you have your abdominals and your glute max on that side, and you have your hip flexors on the other side. Now, what does this do? Well, it puts your hip in a poor position, and it's called anterior pelvic tilt. What happens when you have this muscular imbalance? Well, your glute max is responsible in part for keeping your pelvis pulled in a good alignment, right? It's stopping it from rotating too far forward. But if it's weak, it can't stop that rotation. So your pelvis gets placed in this forward rotation position, which is called anterior pelvic tilt, right? It's tilted forward. Now, remember, as I said, if you have dysfunction in one place, if you have dysfunction in your hips, it cascades up and down the kinetic chain from your knees to your neck. So in this case, let's talk about a particular type of issue or compensation that's created. So if we have a pelvic tilt, let's say that's normal like that, so your hamstrings have two attachments. They're attached to the bottom of your hip, and they're attached to a point behind your knee, and beneath your knee rather, behind it and behind your shin bone. So those are two fixed points. Now let's say your pelvis tilts forward like that, right? There's the pelvic tilt. You still have two fixed points, so what happens to your hamstrings? They get stretched, right? So if you have two fixed points and your pelvis goes like that, well, the hamstring gets stretched. Now, that glute max is weak, so something has to take up the slack of the weakness, and that's going to be your hamstrings. So now your hamstrings are creating force that way to pull your pelvis back into alignment, if it can. That means now your hamstrings are on a chronic stretch, and they're also pulling down, and they're being overworked. That's a really bad situation for rotation and for your back and for injury risk, because you have tight hamstrings, you have a pelvis that's misaligned, you have a lumbar spine that's being pulled into too much extension, and in the golf swing we're trying to rotate on that. And one thing you don't want to do is put a lot of rotation in your lower back, especially if it's in too much extension. So if you have too much extension going on here, and you're trying to rotate because you can't rotate from your hips because it's all tight and misaligned, that's going to be an injury risk. So that's lower cross syndrome. Then there's upper cross syndrome. And just like it sounds, that's more involved in your upper body, but again, it cascades the impact. So you have upper cross syndrome, and that has to do with your shoulders and your upper back. Let's talk about how that X looks. Well, it looks like the upper cross syndrome is common. You've seen it. It's that dumped forward slouchy position, right? It's your upper back, your T-spine has too much flexion in it. The shoulders are crunched together to the midline, and the chin protrudes. That's an exaggerated version of it, but that's what it looks like. How do we get it? Well, you can get it for too much bench pressing, guys. If all you do is bench press and you get that bro look, all right, that's a compensation. The muscles in the front get tight. But that you can also get that from too much work that's forward. We're at our desks, we're hunched over, we're typing, we're looking at the screen, we're texting, we're driving. Maybe you're an auto mechanic and you're hunched over the engine, working all day. So chronic positions, right? What happens is the front of your chest and shoulders get chronically shortened because they're like this all day. So the X will look like this. I'll put it over here. So the front of your chest, let's just call them muscles in the anterior muscles, get chronically tight and short. And then also what happens is that the muscles in your upper back get tight. We call them upper back muscles. Then you have your scapula. Your scapula is your shoulder. It's your shoulder blades, right? That creates your shoulder in part, and then the bony structures here. So when you're dumped forward, that scapula is rolled forward. So your scapula should be moving like this, right? You want your scapula to be able to pull back, extend, drop down, come up. That's a healthy scapula. If it's stuck like this, or at least it can't move that well, and it's stuck, or in this position, the muscles that are controlling, at least some of them, are stretched and weakened. So you have weakened your scapular muscles. So your scapular muscles become weak. And that's so important because you really do want to create some movement here, okay? So that's so important for your golf swing, because if you're stuck like this or just have limited movement, if you can't draw your shoulder back and get into extension, it's really tough to rotate, especially into your backswing. Then the other side of this X is your neck muscles. Let's call them, well, I just call them neck muscles. And that's the other side of the X, right? So you have your scapula and the neck muscles, and then on the other side you have the other X, right? So you have your anterior shoulder. So it's really tough to work out of this position if you're in the golf swing. If you're stuck in these positions, that fluid, effortless swing is elusive. Okay. So what do we do about it? Well, I'm going to go back to what I always talk about. You have to improve your movement quality. Okay, and we talked about this a bit in the last webinar. That is so important. That's the way the top performance coaches get their athletes to perform better and to reduce injury risk, especially as they get older. So what's this involved with? Well, range of motion. And that means movement options. We talked about this a little bit. Movement options, range of motion. If you need this much range of motion in your joints to get movement in a particular technique, like the golf swing, but you only have this much, and your teaching pro is telling you we have to get into a certain position that requires this much movement in your joints, but you only have this much, and you keep trying to get into that bigger motion, you're going to be banging into end range over and over and over again and forcing your joints into positions that they just don't want to go into, and that's an injury risk. The second thing in terms of range of motion is strength. You can't get more flexible, improve your movement options, and not put strength into that, especially in a sports environment. Because in a sports environment, we're putting force into positions. So if you have more movement options, but you don't have the strength to make those positions effective and safe, you're going to be destabilizing your joints, and that's a problem. That's an injury risk. The next thing is movement patterns. And I'm not necessarily talking about the pattern of a sports technique like a golf swing. I'm talking about human movement, squatting, lunging, the cross-crawl pattern, which is so important. The cross-crawl pattern is how we walk, it's how we crawl, it's how we run, it's how we throw a ball, it's how we throw a punch, and it's also how we golf. It's the way you create force. Now, it doesn't necessarily, at first glance look like a punch or look like a throw, but think about it. Just because you're lateral to a target doesn't mean it's not a cross-crawl pattern. And here's what I mean. So when you are taking the club back, your back shoulder's moving away, and then as you come into impact, it looks like this. Well, that's the cross-crawl pattern. Okay, if I'm throwing a punch, maybe I'm wider. If I'm throwing a pitch, maybe I'm wider, but you're still in opposition. That's the cross-crawl pattern, right? It's the opposing of arms and legs, and that's how we move forward. So these patterns have to be tuned up, and a lot of people have lost those patterns. It's basic human movement. I'm not even talking about sports technique or golf technique. The next thing is reflexive movement, reflex responses. Your posture should be reflexive. If this is your posture, if this is your default posture, and you have to think about moving into a good position, you're never going to do that in a golf swing. You can't think your way into a golf swing, into good posture. You can't think your way into rotating around a neutral, stable spine with good posture. It happens too fast. It needs to be a reflex response. Okay, so we need to break this position, and this needs to be something that you just do automatically, without thinking. Think of it like riding a bicycle. You can't think your way into riding a bicycle. Skating, skiing. You can't think your way into those activities. They have to be reflexive. They have to, your brain creates motor patterns that calibrate the type of force and balance and all the other things that you need to be able to ride a bicycle. And it just happens. And the last thing is, again, in terms of reflexes, it's called reflexive strength. Now this is something that you may never have heard of, and I'm pretty sure that recreational golfers, even if they've heard about it, probably don't train it. Sorry guys, you don't train it with curls and bench press and squats necessarily. It's trained in a different way. And in golf training hacks, we use ground-based techniques to do it. But those ground-based techniques are based on the way a child develops, from crawling to standing to walking to running to more complex movements. That's how you can create reflexive strength. What is reflexive strength? It's your neuromuscular system's ability to anticipate, and that's the key word, anticipate movement and force, all right? That's how we react to force. That's how you create fluid movements. Your body is anticipating the level of force, the calibration it needs, what the movement pattern is, what the brain map is for what it needs to do, in this case in the golf swing, and that's how you create that fluid movement. So you got range of motion options, right? You're not always banging into that end range because you need to get here. You got to move the range out so it's easier to do what the teaching pro wants you to do, to make those adjustments. You need strength when you get that range out here. You need to improve basic human movement patterns like lunging and cross crawl and squats. You need to have reflexive response to gravity, a reflexive response to your posture, and you need reflexive strength. That will dial in that fluid, effortless swing. So in the next video, the next webinar, we're going to talk more about hips, because hips need to lead the way in the golf swing. If your hips don't lead the way, you're going to be susceptible to all the flaws we try to avoid, and because your spine sits on your pelvis, if your hips are misaligned, weak and stiff, well, it's tough to get that fluid, effortless swing. So I'll see you in the next webinar. So if you found this helpful, we'd love you to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up, because we want to get our message out to as many people as possible about improving movement quality. So tell all your golfer friends, and you know what? It's not just really for golfers. A lot of people can benefit from improving their movement quality. So thanks for watching.